Well, welcome to another Ozarks Voices Oral History Project. This whole thing is a project of Missouri State University Libraries. I'm Tom Peters, Dean of Libraries, and today's date is Monday, July 21st, 2014. Our special guest today is Jean Coday, President of HomePride Bank in Mansfield, Missouri, as well as President of the Wilder Home Association. Aunt Jean, if I may call you that, welcome.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much.
I'm thrilled you called me that.
Okay. Thanks for, we're actually on the grounds of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home and Museum just east of Mansfield, Missouri. And so thanks for hosting us today.
Well, we're always glad to have people visit.
It's always a pleasure to come out and visit you. Well, let's begin with just where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in Springfield, Missouri at the old St. John's Hospital on November 2nd, 1930.
Okay.
And my parents lived in Ash Grove, Missouri. And so soon after my birth, I guess I went back to Ash Grove.
Okay. Did you grow up in Ash Grove?
Yes, I did.
Go to school there?
Yes, I did.
Okay. When did you come to Mansfield?
Well, my husband and I met at Drury College then. And we were in the same class, and he went to summer school and was ready to go on to graduate school the last semester of our time at Drury. So he went there, and I spent the next year teaching school in Springfield. And when he came back then and was going into the Navy, we were married, and he took a job with Continental Oil Company. And he loved his job, but his uncle passed away, and their family had had the bank since 1892, and he seemed to be the person that they wanted to come to Mansfield.
Oh, okay.
So in 1960, we moved to Mansfield.
Also, it was 1960. Okay.
I had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old son.
So what did you think when you came to Mansfield? Do you feel you...
Well, I grew up in Ash Grove,
Yeah.
so I knew about small town. I didn't know about the hill folk in a small town. But I decided if this was where I was going to live, that I was going to be a part of it. And they've turned out to be wonderful people and very good to me.
Mm-hmm. So you've been here 54 years now?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Well, Laura and Almanzo Wilder and their daughter Rose, who was about 7 at the time, if I'm doing the math correctly, moved to Mansfield in 1894. They had a second child, a son who died in infancy. I don't know if that was before they got to Mansfield.
No, that was when they were in DeSmet.
Okay. Have you heard, or why do you think they settled in Mansfield? Why Mansfield?
Well, they had really hard times and an unhappy life the last 2 or 3 years that they were in DeSmet.
Yeah.
They went for a while and lived about a year with his parents in Minnesota because he had been very ill and had some sort of a stroke, and his daughter thought perhaps he might have had polio.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a crippling effect on his legs and one of his arms.
Mm-hmm.
So they spent a year there, and then they tried Florida, thinking that the warmness and no hard winters would be good for him. But it was very humid, and they weren't real happy. And she said she was quite a thing to be a Yankee woman down there, and didn't ever feel really safe.
Yeah.
So they came back and went back to DeSmet and worked for a while and raised money. And while they were doing this, a friend came to Mansfield after seeing a railroad brochure about the land of the Big Red Apple. And of course they painted quite a lovely picture, talked about the wonderful ability to farm and the rich fertile land. And so they had been down, the friends had, to see it, and others, and they said it was really a nice place. So they had worked and raised $100 and a little more, I guess, for traveling money.
Yeah.
They had a $100 bill, and they fixed a covered vehicle, not really a covered wagon. It was a 2-seated buggy that they took the back seat out of, put a cover on it, and got it all equipped, even with chickens on the back of the buggy that they could put the eggs on. What they did.
Yeah.
And they left on July the 17th and arrived in Mansfield on August the 22nd in 1894.
Okay. somewhere I saw a map that they basically came down eastern Nebraska, kind of cut through Kansas.
Yes.
And
She
then
kept a diary,
okay.
and that eventually became the book on the way home after her death.
So you never met Laura Ingalls Wilder, then?
No, and that really pains me.
Yeah.
Because we were married and back here to visit his father. His mother had already passed. But we were in Mansfield, and I could have seen her if I had been thinking. Because I loved her books, always had. And as a beginning teacher, I loved the books because of the history in them, and I was a history major.
Yeah.
And I've been very sad. And I asked my husband, well, what was she like, Joe? And he said, well, she was just a sweet-looking, pretty little white-haired lady that came to town. But this is this teenage boy that's telling me.
Yeah.
And of course, he probably hadn't read the books, although he was such a reader.
Yeah.
But later he did, at my insistence, and he did appreciate it.
Now, Laura Ingalls Wilder was a columnist for the Missouri Ruralist from about 1911 to 1924, and she struck a chord with her readers. I think they really enjoyed her columns.
As a farm woman speaks, and she thought she was speaking for farm women.
Yeah.
And you have heard the story about how they happened to find out that she had a gift for writing. She was supposed to make a speech at a farm gathering in Mountain Grove and couldn't make it because of him feeling badly, or I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But she wrote her speech and said it. And the editor of the Farm Journal, or the other one that she wrote for, the Missouri Ruralist, I think he's the one that was there.
Yeah.
And he thought it was so good that he asked her to do some others. And
Oh, okay.
that turned into quite a relationship.
So I'm wondering, do people in town remember her primarily as a Missouri Ruralist essayist, because she was in her 60s when she started writing
Yes,
down the little house books.
Yes.
So.
And of course she was in her 50s and a little earlier when she was doing that other writing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that people in this area must have read the Missouri Ruralist. But I personally have never heard anyone speak of her other than as being a farm woman who lived in their community, and they never called her Laura because no one would call someone that they admired other than Mrs. Wilder. And I have always called her that because that's what I heard.
Yeah.
Now others call her by her name that's her writing.
Yeah.
Told them about.
But people in the area really think of her and the family as being just another farm
family,
another
yes.
farm family in the area.
And I think they admired her and him too, because they did a lot with us with what they had.
Yeah. And they were what we would today call progressive farmers. They
Very
were
much so.
trying new techniques, and we just discovered a letter that someone, either Laura or Almanzo Manley, she liked to call him.
There's a story behind why they called each other that.
Tell us that.
Well, when they were engaged and they were talking about getting married, and he said, "I have a sister, Laura, and that's kind of confusing." And he said, "I don't like that name too much anyway." And she said, "Well, my middle name is Elizabeth." He said, "That's it, I'll call you Bessie." And she says, "And where did your name come from?" And he told her the story about it had been in the family for a long, long time. Maybe back to the Crusades when someone gave him this name. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Well, my brother calls me Manny, and my mother and father call me the full name." She says, "I'm going to call you Manley." So that was why she was Bess and he was Manley, and even their daughter, now she called him Papa, but Rose called her Mama Bess most of the time.
Really? Okay. Well, they were progressive farmers. I understand that Mrs. Wilder was well known in the area for her ability with laying hens, that she was able to get them to lay eggs throughout the year. And
that's true. She warmed the water and warmed the food and knew, what to feed them. When they finally got to where they had a producing farm, they decided that each one of them would kind of be a little bit of an expert in one field or the other. She chose poultry and he chose milking cows. Mm-hmm. for his first enterprise, and it was Jersey cows. He was very proud of them, and was real pleased about the amount of butter fat, which nowadays we kind of don't like so much of.
Yeah.
But she was known widely for her hens and sold eggs, sold butter and cream in town, and that was one of the ways they made money.
Now, Rocky Ridge Farm at its peak was about 200 acres?
Yes, they always say more or less, because I think it was more in the 190s something.
Yeah. And a lot of it is really a rocky ridge, wooded, rocky.
This is a ridge we're sitting on.
Yeah.
And it was covered with trees.
Yeah.
And the two of them together, and at first, and later he had more help. She said she knew what to do with one end of a crosscut saw.
Then they also had fruit trees as well on the property.
Now that's part of what they purchased.
Okay.
They purchased the 40 acres, and I've heard all kinds of numbers of trees, but I believe it was about 1,000.
Really?
Now that is a lot.
Yeah.
We're trying to reproduce the orchard in a small way, and we find that 25 is a lot to take care of.
1,000.
But she drew a map of how they were planted and how much space was between each, and how they then planted some other things between them.
Yeah.
Smaller, viney things, not blackberries, but raspberries, and that sort of thing. They had a grape arbor, but it wasn't in the orchard.
Yeah. Do you know what they did with all the apples? Did they?
Well, they sold them.
Sold them all
Yeah,
just as?
Well, they sold them to the market in St. Louis.
Oh.
And that was one of the things that was good about being in Mansfield over maybe Ava or Harville, was it was on the railroad.
Yeah.
He was a drayman in town for a while. He bought the coolies business, the people that came down here with him.
Oh.
Because people didn't have cars,
Yeah.
and they would have to come with horse and buggy, and that was how he delivered it as well, but they could hire him to bring things from the train out to the farms.
So he'd take the apples into town, load them onto the train.
They were very careful. I think they were in barrels.
Yeah. Good. We do know that he we just found some proof that Manley contacted the Fruit Experiment Station in Mountain Grove in 1913, asking about the proper way to lime trees,
That's
apple
right.
trees. And
Well, they were putting the lime on the trees, and deer and others, probably mostly deer, were licking it off.
yeah.
And he wanted to know if they could mix some kind of oil with it or something.
Yeah.
They said, well, they didn't think that would be very good, and they did tell him what to put with it, and I forget what it was now.
Yeah.
But it was something that.
Well, he'd asked about mixing some glue with the whitewash.
Oh, glue, that was it. And they said,
They said,
a little bit of
try
oil.
some crude oil.
Yeah, crude oil. Well, they wouldn't like the way that tasted.
Yeah, but of course,
Yeah, glue was what he was going to put in.
1913 was the dawn of the petroleum era, I guess.
Guess so.
So they were looking for all kinds of uses for it. Getting on to her, her writing of the Little House books. The stock market crash in 1929 really hurt the family. By that time, Rose was a successful author.
Yes, and they had invested some money in the stock market.
And so Rose had
But she influenced them to do that.
Yeah.
And she had quite a bit.
yeah. And so everybody, all three of them were hurt by the stock market crash in 1929. Do you think that was one of the motivators on why she wanted to write down her memories of her childhood?
Oh, I think she, long before that, had wanted to tell the stories. At first, I think she wanted to just do it for her family. And she wanted to tell the stories that her father had told her. And he had also told stories about his father's childhood. So she was going to write that down, and the longer she lived and the longer she looked at it, her own life, she realized that she had lived a pioneer time that will never be back again. When people were moving west for free land and for a new opportunity, and she lived it all.
I read somewhere that if you think about the Great Plains as a whole, the population peaked in the Great Plains about 1920. There was a lot of people moving in, working the land, trying to grow different kinds of crops.
Well, when they got the free land, they had to promise to plow up some of it for
Yeah.
crops.
Yeah.
And of course, this was probably, looking back on it, was something of a mistake to plow up good pasture land
You're right.
that fed the buffalo and would feed their cattle.
Yeah. But then it peaked in about 1920. It's been going down ever since. You know, the urban
Well,
areas are
the
continuing
farms
to grow.
got larger.
Yeah. And,
The small farmer just really can't make a living anymore.
yeah.
And these great huge farms, and so the population went down.
Yeah. And probably the same is true in Missouri as well, where the rural population has really, a lot of it's migrated to the larger cities and
That's
towns.
right. There's, unless they want to go into what their family did,
Yeah.
farming or banking, whatever,
Yeah.
they probably will move to where the good jobs are.
Yeah. I know that her books were almost an immediate success, but how did she become famous? I mean, was it almost like overnight fame that people said, oh, there's this farmhouse wife in rural Missouri who's writing these wonderful books about her memories of her childhood, or did it grow gradually?
I think at first she tried to, through her daughter and through her influence with editors and people, probably she wouldn't have been noticed without that. But she tried the longer book, The Pioneer Girl, and it just was trying to say too much and wasn't personal enough. So she just stopped and started over. And she wrote first about, actually couldn't have been really her memories because she would have been about 3 years old. But she wrote about the little house in the big woods and how she lived with her family as a youngster, and it just grew from there. But in 1932, when this was published, it was immediate success with teachers and their children, and families were pleased with what their children. It really was kind of a phenomenon. It really did well from the very beginning.
Yeah. And people would come to visit with her.
Well, yes. She said she looked up at 7 o'clock one morning, and there was a family that had stopped by to visit. And she was always so surprised because she still, at the time she finished them all, called them her little books.
Yeah.
Because she, she was very surprised.
Yeah.
But then she knew they weren't little books.
Yeah. Maybe I'm naive, but I can't imagine a lot of people who love somebody else. Stephen King, let's pick her, I don't know,
Yeah.
Going to where he lives and wanting to meet him and see where he lives. Do you think there's something about her books that just...
Absolutely.
They wanted to connect with the person who wrote those books.
Well, they were very personal. She wrote them in the first person. And they felt like they knew her.
Yeah.
We still get letters from children that'll say, "Dear Laura, how are you?"
Yeah.
They feel like she's a friend of theirs.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the whole family was included. And even though they had, and she tried to leave out the really, really tough times. The long winter comes the closest to telling how hard it was. But they all worked for each other. The parents, their main objective was to make a good life for the family and their children. And this love that they had for each other, children pick up on that. And I suppose the children that may not even have that themselves can appreciate it and like her. And when she would write a book and they would read it, many more each time each book came out, and they were always asking for another one. And by that time, so were the publishers.
Yeah. Did she ever respond to that fame? Did she ever, feel that it was burdensome or?
Oh, I don't think anybody thought she ever thought it was burdensome. She was surprised, and she was a lover of children. And it was children that seemed to be her first fans, if you want to call them that. Mm-hmm. And she was so happy that she could do something that they enjoyed. Mm-hmm. And the first place that paid very much attention to her was the Detroit Public Library that, named it for her, and she gave them 2 of her original manuscripts.
Yes.
And she didn't think much of anybody else was going to be very interested.
Yeah.
And then she began to get, on her 80th birthday, she got a card with signed by many, many school children. And I know she must have been figuring it out. She certainly was bright, but she was still surprised. I think.
Yeah.
And I don't think it ever changed her very much.
Yeah. So you mentioned the 2 manuscripts the Detroit Public Library currently holds and owns. There's another one at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa.
No, there's not one there.
Oh, really?
The third one that's out is at
Pomona.
Pomona.
Okay. I thought Herbert Hoover had one that Rose gave them.
Well, it could have. Well, it could be one that was done following her death. On the way home, or the other one that that Rose helped write.
Yeah.
The On the Way Home was from the diary that she kept.
One of the late.
And I think, yes, I'm sure there's some goes there.
Okay. And then the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home Association owns some of the manuscripts.
5 of them, plus the Pioneer Girl.
Pioneer Girl, which we were talking about earlier. And I checked over the weekend, and it looks like November of this year, November of 2014, is when Pioneer Girl will be published, edited, and annotated by Pamela Smith Hill.
Well, I have known that they were working on it, and they've had a couple of dates that they hope to have it out, but I'm hoping it will be.
And they were shooting for last summer, and then they announced it was going to be this summer, and now they're saying November of 2014.
Well,
so
that's not far away now.
Don't hold your breath, yeah. But it's in the works. There has been a little controversy and speculation concerning that relationship between Rose and Laura and the writing of the books and the editing of the books. And, you know, Rose, from what I've been able to tell, was an established author. She knew the New York literary scene, if you will.
Oh, yes. She was well
and was
respected.
encouraging her mother to write down her memories from childhood. And that, like you said, I think in some ways, the Little House books probably wouldn't have been the big hit they were if it hadn't been for Rose.
I think her
providing an
editing
entree.
helped some.
Yeah.
And I think her connections helped a lot. They didn't have an effect on the writing, but they did have an effect on it being published.
Yeah. So you think that Rose wasn't really a ghostwriter in any extent?
I don't think anyone would call her a ghostwriter that knew the whole story, but this is speculation. Nobody knows for sure.
Yeah.
But I do know that Mrs. Wilder talked to her. She made suggestions. Some of them Mrs. Wilder went along with, others she didn't. And I know that she typed the first ones for her and would suggest changes. So in that way, they made together and made change. But I don't think Rose actually wrote any part of the books. I really don't think so.
So from what I've been able to see is that Laura, Mrs. Wilder, wrote out the original manuscripts were in pencil.
That's true.
Typically on either 50/50 tablets or Big Chief tablets, manufactured in Springfield, Missouri.
That's right.
And then it went on from there, get typed up, and then some corrections would be made and whatnot, and editorial changes would be made, and back and forth with the publisher.
And they might suggest changes. I'm not sure
Yeah.
about that, but those letters I think are in Iowa.
Yeah. So Rose Wilder Lane, had her own life. I read that she built. Let me back up and say when Laura and Manley bought Rocky Ridge Farm, it was basically undeveloped. There wasn't much here.
That's true.
Yeah. So the home they actually built here.
Yes.
And then when Rose became wealthy and relatively wealthy and relatively famous, and she was one of the leading lights of what became the Libertarian Party.
Very much so.
She built them a house just over the ridge.
That's right. She felt that her father's frail health that he was doing too much. Of course, he continued to do things as long as he lived, as much as he could do, because that's just the way he was.
Yeah.
But she also gave them $500 a year for as long as she could, until they lost a lot of their money. But she wanted them to have a modern home. And they said okay.
Did she do it as a surprise for them?
Well, it was supposed to be a surprise.
I mean,
but the father was over there lots, and Now, I don't think that Mrs. Wilder saw it until Christmas morning, but you know she knew that
Yeah.
we're building a house over there.
On our property.
Yes,
Somebody's building a
yes.
house on our property. What's going on there?
Absolutely.
So they moved over there, stayed there for about a decade or so?
About 9 years.
Okay. And then,
Rose was living in this house, and she brought electricity to both places, and it wasn't to farm houses for another 20 years. And she also had one person phone lines brought out because she had to talk to her editors, and she didn't want to be on a party line.
yeah. But then Rose eventually left. I guess she went to New York.
Yes, she first went to Columbia, and that's where that she did some research and work on her writings and her mother's, and then she went back to New York.
And then when she went back to New York,
Well, she lived in New York a while, and then that's when she bought the home in Connecticut.
okay. Then Laura and Manley decided to move back to the homestead here.
Yes, they did.
That must have been a difficult decision to.
Well, they said they had to pass this house as their home that they had built from. They moved an addition to the log cabin down, and that was their kitchen. And then they added a room that was both for them to sleep and living room and sleeping, and a loft above for Rose. And then added gradually to it over a number of years, completed it in 1913. And actually Laura drew the plans for the living room part of it and had a lot to do with how it grew. And they just loved the place. And when they'd go by and see the windows boarded up, it just made them feel, really bad.
So they moved back,
They moved back,
and basically she spent the last 30 years of her life
yes,
living here.
yes.
Manley died about a decade before she died. She
Yes.
died in 1957.
Yes.
Yeah.
He lived past his 90th birthday, more so than she did, but she wanted to live to be 90 because he had.
Yeah, she died just a few days after
Yes,
that.
yes.
So after Laura died in 1957, Rose and what I read was that a Mansfield resident by the name of Irene Lichty formed the Wilder Home Association.
Well, she and her husband were instrumental in it.
Okay.
Her mother was a Civil War veteran's wife. That was a case of a 60-year-old man, I think, marrying a 20 or 30-year-old woman, her mother and father. But her father had been a Civil War veteran, and her mother was about the same age as Mrs. Wilder. And Mrs. Wilder always went to town on Wednesdays, and two of the people that she visited on her trips on Wednesday, one of them was Mrs. Lichty's mother, and the other was Aunt Daisy Freeman, who was the wife of the original president of the bank.
Then you arrived in 1960 with your husband and two children.
Two boys.
Two boys at that point. So how did you become involved in the Wilder Home Association?
Well, because Mrs. Lichty asked both my husband and I if we would come and serve on the board. And I said yes, 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 and he did too.
And how was it during those early decades of the Home Association?
Well, all we had was the home and 2.5 acres. And, lots of times we met in the boardroom at the bank or someplace else, sometimes at the home. Mrs. Lichty was coming out and opening the home, bring her lunch with her, and she also had a little case with some things to sell in the bedroom. And that was what was going on when we came.
And how did it grow? I mean, did you see more and more visitors year after year, or
Yes.
How did it grow?
And Mrs. Lichty knew by the time that we came here, which was 3 years after the board was formed, that they needed to be better organized in order to take care of the visitors. So she continued to do that and did it for a number of years, and then she had help with docents that would show the people around and the board also helped her in making some repairs on the home, which was done. We decided that if we were going to show the house, it had to be a bit stronger. And it was reinforced with cables through the upper level to hold it together. And then early on, and this was here, this room that we're in, which was Almanzo's workshop, and which was taken down for the museum, was their garage for their cars. And then another on the other end, which it had at one time held the furnace in the basement of that part.
I didn't realize this was Almanzo's workshop.
It was.
We're sitting in Almanzo's workshop. That's great.
And I think they added the wood on the inside. I think it was a bit more rustic than it was his, but it was his workshop.
This is his workshop. Very good. Then Rose Wilder Lane died in 1968, and this may be when we should start talking about Roger MacBride. So Roger MacBride, what I've seen is that he described himself as an adopted grandson.
Yeah, he called himself her foster grandson.
Yeah.
Whatever foster means.
Yeah. And he was an attorney,
Yes.
Harvard man.
Yes.
Very
bright.
Very bright man. And he was the first, in 1976, he was the first libertarian candidate for president.
That's true.
He was also a co-producer and co-creator of the Little House TV series.
I don't know. A good friend of his was. I personally don't know that he was.
I think he was
financially in it.
I think he was involved in some.
Well, I'm sure that they had to buy the rights to the what, he would be involved in that way.
Yeah.
And I do know that Fred Friendly, who was one of the sponsors of that, or a producer, I think. He was never listed as a producer, but that essentially maybe that's what he did.
Yeah. So my understanding is that when Rose passed away, her will stated that Roger MacBride was the sole heir to her estate, which included Laura Ingalls Wilder's
That's true.
Intellectual property, which had gone to Rose as a life estate when Laura passed in 1957. And just to complete that thread there, then Roger had an adopted daughter,
Yes.
Abigail MacBride Allen. She was born in 1970, so she's about 44 years old now. And then when he died, she was the sole heir of his estate. So, through these deaths and last will and testaments, the Laura Ingalls Wilder intellectual property, all of the books, have now gone to Abigail MacBride Allen.
That's true.
And there was a court case about this in the late 90s, latter half of the 90s, because Laura in her will had stated that she wanted Rose to have this as a life estate, but then when Rose passed, Laura's wish was that her intellectual property and all the proceeds therefrom would go to the county library. And one of the branches she helped form right here in Mansfield.
That's true. And she was so pleased that it was named for her.
Yeah. And the library, when Roger passed, decided to assert its claim with a lawsuit. Never went to court is what I've read, but it was settled out of court.
Yes, it was.
Your thoughts on this whole
Well, I'm
events?
glad that the county library system got some money. I wish it had come about in a different way. And of course, the association had nothing to do with that. And it was over the rights of one book, I think, that they actually decided to make the case with. But they were awarded $800 and some thousand.
So it never went to. There was never a court decision per se. So we never really got a sense of how the courts would have ruled on that. I don't know the details of that lawsuit, but it was settled before it went to.
And I would assume that whoever was representing the library system would have thought that it might, for the entire state, it might not have come about that would be taken away from the MacBrides because of the strength of Rose's will.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a speculative question, and we've talked about this before. Although Laura Ingalls Wilder spent most of her adult life, 63 years by my reckoning, in Mansfield, many people don't think of her as a Missouri author. And she was living here decades before she started to write, the books.
Yeah, I think that's a shame, too.
She's really known. Yeah. And you think of Mark Twain as being, everybody thinks of Mark Twain as a Missouri author.
Because he was born in Missouri.
But he spent most of his adult life in New York and Connecticut.
Yes.
So.
She's a Missourian by choice.
Yes.
And it's absolutely her choice. Because when her daughter lived in San Francisco, she very much wanted them to come and live closer to her.
Yeah.
She thought the climate would be good and that, it would just be a good thing for them. And Laura said, she went one summer in 1915 during the Spanish Exposition and spent 2 months there and wrote back letters to Almanzo, which he saved, and that became a book. She said, no, this is a nice place to visit, but I want to go back to the Ozarks.
Yeah.
And she said over and over in many ways how she thought it was just the perfect place for them. And then when her husband died, I'm sure Rose offered her to come and live with her in Connecticut. And she had a winter home in Harlingen, Texas. And I'm sure she would have included her mother, and her mother said no.
Yeah.
And it was this house and this place that were just such a part of her that she wasn't happy any place else.
Yeah.
And she thought it was a perfect place to live.
Have you ever heard did she ever express any desires to return to South Dakota or?
Well, they made several visits.
Uh-huh.
And the last one that they made together, and he drove, and I'm sure everybody held their breath. It was in 1937 to Old Settlers Day. And she wrote articles for the paper that she was writing for and told about that visit and how the first morning after they were there, they were having breakfast in a restaurant. And 2 men went by, and then one came back and said, do you remember me? And it was a man who had been a younger student when she was in school there. And of course she visited her sister who was still living close to there. And her other sister who was up close to the big monument in South Dakota. And they enjoyed it, being the old settlers, and folks made some special notice of what she had done. And she got to see the place where they had lived out in the country, both her husband before and after they were married, and where her parents had lived. And mentioned that the big cottonwoods that they'd planted were there, but another house took its place.
Yeah.
And then the home in town, which they still show for visitors in Dismount. But they had a good time.
Yeah.
But she talked about how glad she was to be home.
But there's something about this place, and they had the first years of their marriage were very difficult, financially and health-wise.
They cut wood and sold it in town, and I'm sure it was hard to do. And Rose, I think, felt that she was maybe not as well off as some of the students that she went to school with. Although I don't think anyone was so well to do that they would have looked down on her. I think possibly that was a bit of her own feeling and not the other children.
Yeah.
I happen to know some people that were the other children.
They don't remember it that way.
They don't remember it that way.
Yeah. Well, although this is an oral history project, I need to ask you about the future of the Home Association. I know you've got some great plans for...
Well, every day we talk about what we want to do, you know, poor folks have poor ways. And we've had a fundraiser, and we've worked on raising money, and we want to build an archival library to take care of all the many wonderful treasures that we have of Laura's. And then we want a museum that will be right for storing the things that people view, and have a place for authors and people who are really interested to come and do research. And we're almost there.
Okay, good.
And when we do that, then we're going to have to work on getting people around on the property, building trails and that sort of thing. We're really interested in completing the trail between the two houses where the family walked back and forth when Rose lived here and they lived there. And then my big dream is to turn this back into the farm homestead that it was when they lived here, so that 50 or 100 years from now, children could come and see what it was like in the 1920s and 30s, early 30s.
A real working farm.
A real
with
farm.
Chickens and cows.
Well, we have chickens.
Oh.
We have a chicken house that was built by an Amish man, and it doesn't look exactly like hers. She had the low, long kind, and this is more of a, but we have 7 hens and 1 rooster, and we get some eggs every day.
Oh, good.
We have a garden, which is planted by the seed company that's out of town here, very famous. And I hope we will take out all of this driveway and come up the original driveway.
Yeah.
And make it look like it did when they lived here as farmers.
Was the original driveway to the west, coming up from the west?
It was, well, that was where the road from town was, and that's why the house is facing that way. But you can see the 2 posts that were the gate, and they're along the highway out here to the north. And it came up, and it was a circular drive. And it went on back down to that road because the highway came through here in 1932 and kind of cut their little farm in 2. Although that a lot more was on this side than that side.
Yeah. How many acres does the home association own?
About 180.
Oh, so almost back to the original size.
Yeah, that's what we did for the first number of years, was try. Well, we didn't actually buy anything until 1990. And that's when we purchased the rock house and 50 acres for $100,000. And we paid that back, and then we bought the place across the way. And the last thing that we purchased, and that we're still paying for, was the 87 acres around us that made a horseshoe around this place. We had to have it. And also acquired a nice 4-bedroom home that we can use for people to stay when they come to visit.
Do you think that just having the home and museum here near Mansfield has been, what kind of impact has it had on the community? Well,
it has to have helped some, because people, I think, buy gas and eat here. But there aren't, they need to have more places for them to stay. We have a lovely bed and breakfast downtown. But, with a family or a number of carloads of people, lots of times they'll either stay in Mountain Grove or Ava or go on to Branson or to Springfield. So it hasn't done what it could do. And we're hoping that building this new museum, they've told us that we would have 15% more visitors. And I'm hoping that that will encourage more businesses to come to kind of have places for them to stay and places for them to eat, and maybe the town will finally grow. Baker Creek, which is the seed company, has several big festivals a year with 6,000 or 7,000 people. Well, it just makes sense that most towns this size don't have one place like that, and Mansfield has 2. And we have some far-thinking men that are trying their best, or people, not just men, to make this happen. But it's been a long, slow process.
When I was growing up, my mother read some of the Little House books to us when I was a child, and
good for her.
Yeah, she was a teacher, and she read us some good books. so I often think of them as children's books, but my sense is that adult scholarly interest in her works is increasing recently.
I don't think it's ever gone away, and I do think it is there are more people. Very few weeks go by that someone that's doing an article for a magazine or wants to write a book, you know, this, it's happening all over. And it's kind of remarkable for books that were written that long ago. You do know that her books went to Japan and Germany after World War II. And I think that made her become an international writer. And I think you can tell the change in the writing style, not the style as much as how it's written more for a little older mind as she grew older in her books. And I think that then it became that they weren't just written for 4th or 5th grade readers, they were written for at least through middle school. And to tell you the truth, I think I've been out of middle school a while. And I love to read them, and I usually reread them every year.
I've been out of middle school so long that we used to call it junior high school.
Yeah.
There's middle school.
I even taught junior high school in Springfield 1 year.
That's right. So middle school was a phrase that I never heard until.
Well, I thought they were crazy, you know, wanting to put 6th graders with 7th and 8th graders and 9th graders into high school.
Yeah. Do you think her books have become timeless? That, you know,
Yes.
really generations
Yes.
will just love her books.
Yes. And it will ebb and flow, I think. And some of our people who are really knowledgeable about her books worry that, you know, books now are on, we worry about their not wanting to hold a book in their hand. But it seems that our sales here of books is pretty lively. And I think everyone would like to hold her books and read them. And I feel like she told a story in a way that is timeless. And it was in a way that is so charming and so sweet that everybody feels better after they've read it.
Yeah, so engaging too.
Yes. You just feel like you're part of the family.
Yeah.
And that's what the children who read those or have them read to them feel.
Well, thanks very much. We've been
You're so welcome.
speaking with Jean Coday, who's the president of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home Association. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just hope that that this building that we built comes to fruition, and we could use any kind of help we could. I don't guess that wouldn't need to go on a thing like this, but I just want everyone who hears about this to know that it was a long, hard struggle, but that we finally made it. And we're so happy that it will be here for generations of people.
I think generations hence will thank you for preserving this amazing little farm in the Ozarks.
Well, I say you come and see us.
Well, Bessie and Manly lived for years and years, decades, and enjoyed it immensely.
And loved it.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much.
You're so welcome.